This is one of my most favorite scriptures. I like to do it on Mother's Day because it reminds us that even Mary, the most perfect, the one we see in porcelain, always calm and cool and collected on the mantle, forgot her child in Jerusalem, in like a whole other city. To be fair, we don't often see Mary very human, very real. She's always perfect. Her skin, no matter the skin tone, is beautiful and sometimes a little fragile. We see her kind of lifted up. There is no statue that I know of that is famous for this moment where Mary, in just joyful release at finding her child, and yet a bit of rage, I'm sure, at between Jesus, like, is saying, "Child, why have you done this to us?" Like, we don't put that in stained glass windows. There's no cathedral of Our Lady of Tween Mom. There is just this moment where Mary is so real, and otherwise she is not very real at all. She's here, she's direct, she's bold. Like, this is so different from the Mary of image, the Mary of history that we have inherited. Mary in history is perfect in almost every way. She has just given birth in a manger, and she looks amazing. She is surrounded by animals, and you just don't have any sense that anything could smell badly. And she doesn't even get mad at that drummer boy who comes in. Mary just always calm, cool, quiet, perfect. In the pictures of her breastfeeding, which makes her very human, it seems that she didn't have to see a lactation consultant. She never had mastitis. That baby latched right away, and like, obviously he should. He's supposed to be very special. This Mary of the temple, though, like, there's grit and energy that I love about her. This Mary of the temple is the parent to tween Jesus. And to be fair, it's not just Mary and Joseph, but just like now, if the mom forgets someone, everybody remembers that a little bit more. They were traveling in a group. This would have been the practice, to travel in a kinship group with your family, your friends you make into family, this pilgrimage in and out of Jerusalem. And to be fair to Mary and Joseph, Jesus isn't a baby tethered to her body, bound up in a cloth. Jesus isn't a toddler underfoot. He is a tween, experiencing these kind of new boundaries, pushing them as well. He would have been off with cousins and relatives, playing, talking, chatting, maybe getting into mischief. And so Mary and Joseph don't notice that he isn't there. They go a whole day's journey, and then that little sense, where is he? Must raise up within Mary, and she goes and she looks for him, and they search for him among the family, among the kin, and they realize he is not with him. And so Mary and Joseph make the dangerous choice of traveling without the whole group back to Jerusalem to find him. And they find him in the temple, and Mary, probably rejoicing and yet enraged, says, "Child, why have you treated us like this?" And Jesus, in all of his tween angstiness, says, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know I'd be in my Father's house?" I mean, it's a miracle that this child lives. Like, Jesus, in the fullness of his humanity too. This moment of family, of richness, of Mary and Jesus, truly human, truly sacred. There's so many avenues that we explore Mary that are not very human. We have this mystique about Mary, particularly about Mary's anatomy and the specialness of the birth of Jesus. It makes her kind of like a very modest Wonder Woman, like set apart from everybody else. And so I want to dive into Mary's humanity, because every time Mary talks or speaks in the gospel, it is gritty and honest and real. And yet the Mary on our mantle, which there's literally a product called Mary on the Mantle that's trying to compete with Elf on the Shelf, it keeps coming up in my news feed. It's being marketed to Catholic families, so I think their algorithm is off, but that's fine. This Mary, she is not just on the mantle, and she is not just quiet and silent and always nice and gentle and sweet. This Mary does hard work. See, in the early Christian church, the earliest writings don't really talk about Mary. They don't really talk about a divine involved birth. They don't really talk about a virgin birth. That is the seed of making Mary otherworldly. Now, there's a lot that happens in like 2,000 years of Christian history that really works to keep Mary a virgin. There's this translation from Isaiah in Hebrew to Greek that would have translated a young woman, a maiden, into virgin. The context around the stories that early Christians are telling is incredibly diverse. They live with this diversity of gods and goddesses, ancient and current at the same time. And so they inherit stories of goddesses like Athena, who is a virgin goddess, and it is not necessarily about her marital status, but this translation of virgin that means a woman belonging to herself. A woman belonging to herself. This is why the angel Gabriel can ask Mary for consent instead of her father or instead of her husband. Mary is a woman who belongs to herself. That's a context around the language that I don't think we hear all the time or receive all the time. We think about it in such biological terms. And we're not like the first ones. John Dominic Crossan, a scholar, would investigate kind of extra biblical literature and say that early Christians began to kind of come up against this edge of personal character assassination against Jesus. And that one of the easiest ways to assassinate his character was to call him that B word. Maybe not exactly that, but translated into English, about not having parents who were married, except it was even more than that. A word that is reserved for the child who is the product of a harmful or violent or illicit physical interaction between two people. This is part of what the early Christians are coming up against. They're also in a culture where people talk about important people in very particular ways, where the heavens line up with stars and births are fantastic and wonderful. Alexander the Great's mother heard thunder and lightning and became pregnant. Alexander the Great was understood to be a god king, the divine enfleshed. The Caesars not only had powerful human dads, but were attributed to the sons of gods. One involving a snake that impregnates Augustus' mother. Pythagoras and Plato have divine intervention, divine involvement. This is the way ancient people talked about someone who was really important. Someone is so important that they have this God-involved birth, this God-involved conception. They also understand women at that time to not contribute biologically to a child. I mean, I feel like every grandma and midwife probably thought that was not real, but every physician thought that women were just sort of fancy incubators and they could do your laundry and carry a baby. Origen of Alexandria writes about this moment. About 200 years after the death of Christ, he writes about Plato in a long written argument. People are just fabricating such things about a man whom they regard as having greater wisdom and power than most others. And so they say he received at the beginning of his composition of a body of a superior and more divine sperm, as if it were appropriate for those who surpass ordinary human nature. Right? Plato is seen as having an extraordinary nature, divine inspired. And so this Christian writer, Origen, is saying that is made up. These people are just talking about someone important, like he is otherworldly. And then Origen, in this kind of mental gymnastics, continues to talk about Mary and Jesus as the only real deal in that kind of story. Like, it gets so significant and so involved in Mary's biology that there is even writings about some kind of mysterious and a little bit gross postpartum exam that proves Mary is a virgin even after birth. Origen gets translated by Jerome, and then every 100 years it seems to come up. And meanwhile, the people are starting to celebrate Mary on their own. They're starting to celebrate the feast. They're starting to see her as someone who can be present and compassionate and meaningful. And the Western church and the Eastern church begin to disagree. The Eastern church says Mary is the God-bearer and names her as such and celebrates her as such. And the Western church begins this kind of theology around original sin. And as the theology of original sin elevates, and as the early church fathers and their anxieties about body and being and their own sinfulness grows, so does this kind of mental gymnastics around the nature of Jesus and eventually the nature of Mary. They can't be human. They can't be touched by original sin. The church in the West doesn't confirm all of this until much later. The doctrine of virgin birth stands for all time. But this sense of Mary having a significant conception really takes hold when science catches up with those grandmas and midwives and says, oh, women contribute something to a child. And so as the Enlightenment happens, you have Mary's DNA, Mary's body starts to matter. And if Mary was born in a regular old normal way, well, she's going to impact Jesus with all of that original sin. And so in 1854, the Pope officially names Immaculate Conception for Mary. There had been ancient stories, early stories, extra-biblical literature that had explored Mary growing up in all kinds of ways. Some of them might be delightful, and some of them involve Mary being gifted to the temple, much like Samuel would have been gifted by Hannah, having a special birth of someone who had longed for a child but hadn't yet conceived one. Mary is gifted to the temple, and then they talk about angels even feed her. Like, how delightful. And so as science changes and as people start to understand that Mary is involved, Mary's birth becomes sacred and separate. Why would the church go to such lengths to keep Mary and Jesus so separate, so at a distance. I feel like there are two things at play here. One is that Mary's power is meaningful. Mary's presence matters, and that the church over time makes her more silent, more still. She shows up for everything, and she gives her body. It is kind of a metaphor for what the church would like from some of its people. I think the other thing is at play is when people do powerful, wonderful, amazing works, we would prefer them to be otherworldly. We'd prefer for Mary to be like a really modest Wonder Woman, and Jesus to be like Superman. Because Mary, the one who sang the Magnificat about God lifting up the lowly and throwing the mighty from their thrones, if she's so otherworldly, she's so distant from us, we are not expected to sing her song and do her work. Mary as human, Mary as person, expects so much from us. She expects us to show up with all of the grit and grace and courage at every moment along the way. And that is hard. May we have the courage. May we have the courage to try. May it be so. Amen.